Hello everyone, this is James Shore with another how-to video. I'm recording this on July 9th, 2015, picking up right where we left off in the last episode. And what we've been doing is going through JavaScript gotcha. Specifically, we're looking at JS hints options and whether or not we want to have various options turned on or off. And I'm using this as an opportunity to sort of discuss the kinds of things that can go wrong in JavaScript. When we left off, we had just looked at the future hostile option, and the next one on our list is globals. You can specify that in options, or it can be passed in as a separate parameter. I've got it called out as a separate parameter here in the JS hint runner, and so that's where we'll put our globals. But right now we don't need to define any globals because by default JS hint doesn't complain when you use a global variable. We'll get into that option in a little bit. Next option is purely code style. It wants you to put ifs, like this one right here, inside of parentheses. That's one of Douglas Crockford's style preferences. It's not really an error issue. Similarly, indentation, we'll skip that one, as purely style. Iterator, this refers to a very old feature of JavaScript that was never really supported properly. It's obsolete. Turning this option on prevents warnings about that, but that's not something we need. Late def, now this is a useful one. If you use a variable before it's defined, for example, if we were to say console.log a, that's clearly an error. We've tried to use the variable before it was defined. Instead of seeing 42 come out, for example, what we're going to see is undefined right there. So because that's an error, we want to get an error message about it. However, by default, this late def will also complain about functions that are declared late. So I'd have to declare my function before I call it. So this should pass lint just fine. Well, there you see it's complaining about var a equals 42. A is being used before it's defined. So let's fix that. And now it will work. But what if I wanted to call delete me before I define delete me? This is perfectly valid JavaScript. JavaScript does something called variable hoisting, where it takes all of your variables, and it takes all your functions and moves them to the top of the file, or really the top of the enclosing function. It does the same thing for variables, but it only moves the declaration, not the actual value, which is less useful. So this is perfectly fine. There's no error here, but lint will complain about it nonetheless. It will say delete me was used before it was defined. So to fix that, what we're going to do is we're say we do want to be warned about errors, about variables being used before they're defined, but don't tell us about functions. So we're going to pass in this special no func option here, and that will cause our lint to work just fine. Max complexity, this is a style thing. It's trying to enforce good design. I don't think computers can enforce good design, so I skip it. Max depth is the same. Max error reports how many errors JS hint will tell you. That's not really important for us. Max len is about how long your lengths can be. Max params is about how many params you can have to a function. These are not error-based issues. These are purely about what's good design, and those should be resolved through conversation amongst team members. Computers are too rigid for these to be useful, in my opinion. Max statements, also similar. Now this next one, they have deprecated this option, but I'm actually sad that they have done so. By default, the style in JavaScript is when you create a function, you call new, or when you create an object, you say new my class. Now it turns out that in JavaScript, you can say that on any function. Any function you can say new on, whether or not it's actually designed to be a class or an object. And for more details about how objects work in JavaScript, check out this lessons learned video right here. It goes into a lot more detail. Suffice it to say that if you say new on a function that isn't meant to be a class, you can get wonky behavior. So the common convention amongst JavaScript programmers is to have functions that are meant to be classes start with a capital letter, and functions that are not meant to be classes start with a lowercase letter. And JS hint will help you see that. If you say new delete me here, which would be an error, you'll get this error, and constructor name should start with an uppercase letter. Well, unfortunately, they are taking that out. They're effectively doing this, which I think is a mistake, personally. All right, next. There's a keyword available inside of functions called arguments, and it has properties called caller and callee. If you have useStrict turned on, those are not available, but you'll only find that out if when your code runs. So you can also add no_arg equals true to prevent that. Next, comma operator. It's possible to have multiple statements sort of strung together using a comma operator. That's a very unusual thing to do, so we can turn that off. If you have a good reason for stringing together statements with the comma operator, you can always remove that option. I personally don't often find use for it. No empty. This basically will warn you if you have an empty block. That's probably an error if you do, but it's not strict. It's not really a problem, so they're taking it out. Non-breaking white space. These are special characters. It's probably not going to be an issue, but again, I err on the side of adding a little bit more than I need to. No new. So what's going on here is if you call a constructor, it returns the object that's been constructed. If you call a constructor and it doesn't return an object, that's probably a mistake. You've probably forgotten to do something with it. So you might say, for example, new date, but you're not doing anything with the result. That is, well, it doesn't do anything. And because that's a common mistake, no new checks for it. Now, it's possible you might have designed your function to have side effects that occur upon construction. That's really bad form. It is a design issue, and so not necessarily something you want to catch with lint, but just don't do that. So now we'll see this method. Do not use new for side effects. All right, what's next? Type of. You can use the type of operator in JavaScript to determine what kind of value is in a variable. So if I said a equals bar, and I logged the type of a, you'll see a string come out. Right there, string. Well, in some cases, not very often, you might want to say if type of a is string, then we do something. And in this case, I'll just say hi. And there you can see our hi. Well, it's also possible because the value of type of is a string, it's possible that you could mistype this. You could, for example, say string like this and not realize it. That's an error, and there's a very limited list of things that type of can be equal to. So lint gives us an error on that. No type of would allow us to turn that off, but usually you're going to want it. Quote mark, this says which types of quotes we want. JavaScript can use single or double quotes for a string. They are identical in terms of their behavior. There's really no reason to prefer one or another other than code style. And again, I don't like to enforce code style in lint, so we'll skip that one. Variable shadowing. This one is a little bit obscure. When you have a function inside of another function, as we do whenever we define a function inside of our IFI, then it is possible to define a variable in that inner function that has the same name as a variable in the outer function. And if you do that, the inner function can no longer see the variable in the outer function. Normally, it can. It's possible that this could cause some errors. I have never seen that happen, and I actually find it very useful to be able to reuse variable names, so I don't enable this option. But if that's a problem for you, that's what this is for. Next, single groups. This says don't put parentheses around things that don't need them. That's purely style. There's no error that can occur there. Strict. This requires us to use strict mode. Absolutely. I always use strict mode. So right now, if we took out the use strict option, our lint would pass, but we want lint to say no. We need to use strict. So I say strict equals true, and what we will get is an error that we're not using strict. There we go. Undef. This is buried down here in alphabetical order, but this is one of the most useful things. This will force us to define every variable we use. So right now, if I say a equals, or rather, let's do console.log a. Now, If I run this code, we will get an error because we're in strict mode. Right there, we're getting an error, A is not defined. But strict mode only catches errors at runtime, which means that if I don't run the function for some reason, which can happen even for valid code, you can have valid code that your tests don't hit, even though we prefer to have our tests hit every line of code. If we don't run this code, then we won't get an error. Now, for that reason, and also just because lint runs faster and tends to give us more precise error messages, more readable error messages, it's nice if we get errors about variables that we have not defined. The way you do that is adding this undef option. This, however, is going to complain about a lot more than just our missing variable. You can see right here, line 56, A is not defined, but we're also getting console is not defined, fail is not defined, complete is not defined, process, boy, thing after thing after thing. This is where defining our globals comes in. First off, we want to define a couple of environments. We want to say that we are running in Node and we're going to be running in the browser. That will take care of things like console and require. So let's go ahead and do that. Now we're just complaining about desk, task, fail, and A, which is legitimate. Desk, task, and fail, those are JS hint specific. So rather than saying that they are part of our globals, which I could do right here. I could say desk is false. That means that we use desk, but we don't change it. Task is false, complete is false, and fail is false. If I did that, now it's not going to complain about any globals other than A, which we want it to complain about. So that's one way of solving it. However, now this is saying that these globals are valid for every single file. Well, really, they're only valid for our Jake file. So the other option is take these same values and put them up in a globals comment at the top of your file. And that's what I'll do for globals that are only used by one file, like that. And that will also work. So undef, definitely one of the more useful options. I highly recommend that one. Unused will tell you when you define a variable but not use it. I don't tend to use this one, partly because sometimes as I'm working, I'll just comment code out temporarily. Personally, even though I like things to be strict, I find unused to be a little too strict for me, so I'm not going to use that. And then finally, var statement. In the latest version of JavaScript, the var keyword has been replaced with the let and constant keyword, which uses lexical scoping. That is, you can define a variable inside an if statement and it will only exist inside that if statement. That's a great new set of tools for people using the latest version of JavaScript. But if you want to support older browsers, or really right now, current browsers, it's not an option yet. So I'm going to leave this turned off. All right, so those are all of our enforcing options. There's some relaxing options that makes JS hint a little less strict. I don't think any of these are ones that I care about. You are welcome to look at it and see what you think. And then you can also specify environments. This basically sets up global variables for you and sometimes turns on or off certain options. I'm going to ignore those as well. We've already got Node and browser, which are the ones we want. Now, before we finish up, one last gotcha that JS hint cannot catch for you, and that is the fact that all of JavaScript's numbers are floating point numbers. They are not integers, which means that they are inherently imprecise. This is a problem when you get into really, really, really large numbers. Basically, anything bigger than 2 billion you want to keep an eye out for. Or if you're using, well, decimal points. If you say 1.2, for example. The issues with floating point are outside of the scope of this episode. This is something that you should know about for every programming language. Just be aware that when you type a number in JavaScript, it is being converted to floating point math, and that means that there's some imprecisions that you need to keep an eye out for. In particular, be very, very careful about using any of JavaScript's numbers to represent money, because even though you might have something like 20 cents in a variable, and perhaps you're multiplying it by 0.1 for some reason, let's say you're splitting it 10 ways. Even though you would expect the answer to that to be 2 cents, because you're using floating point math, sometimes the answers aren't going to be what you expect. All right, those are JavaScript gotchas. I'm going to go ahead and put this back, clean up this file. There we go. We should have a nice clean build now, and we do. Your exercise for this time is to finish going through the options for your linting tool, whether you're using JSLint, JSHint, ESLint, or something else. Go through all the options, figure out which ones you want to use to reduce the amount of errors that you have in your program. I also recommend that you take some time to look into floating point accuracy. You can find more at this URL. This is something really important. It's not specific to JavaScript, but you will run into it in JavaScript. All right, that is it for this time, and that is also the end of our code safety chapter. Next time, we're going to start looking at how to test JavaScript. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you next time.